A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Yesterday on 2020, we interviewed Chloe Cole, the young American girl who transitioned from a girl to a boy and back to a girl again. That whole process started at the age of 13. She was here in Australia at the invitation of the Australian Christian Lobby, who had arranged a tour for her around Australia. It culminated in Brisbane last night. And as well as Chloe, there were other people presenting at that meeting as well. One of them is Dr. Andrew Amos. He's a registered psychiatrist, and he gave a very, very factual, balanced argument as to the evils of gender transition. And Dr. Amos joins us now. Dr. Amos, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be with you.
It is, mate. I will call you Dr. Amos because we're both Andrews. Can I ask, tell us about the tour firstly. Where did it go and what did you guys do?
Look, I'd like to start off by really thanking the ACL and Wendy Francis, Joshua Rowe, Ashland Vice for organising all of this. So we focused on the capital cities of a couple of states. We started in Sydney last week, spoke at the New South Wales Parliament to a group of MPs and members of the public. We then moved on to Canberra and spoke both at a church function and then at the federal parliament the day after. Then we moved on to Adelaide and had a series of meetings with various MPs, but also a couple of ministers, which was fantastic. Presented to the SA Parliament. That one was organised by Frank Pangello, one of the MPs there. And then we rounded off the Australian leg of the tour last night in Brisbane and presented at the Grand Chancellor. And I believe that Chloe Cole and her brother Mitchell are now on their way to New Zealand, where they're going to have a similar tour.
Yeah, and so what was your perception of the response from the politicians that heard Chloe Cole's story?
Look, it was a really interesting set of responses. We met a group of people who I think have the same passionate understanding that this is something that is not only morally wrong, but in most cases evil. And they also want to do something about it. They feel very trapped. And I have a little bit of sympathy for this. So what they literally told us was, I, as a politician, would very much like to stop the evil of gender-affirming care. They know that kids are being hurt. They feel that as an individual MP or even as a minister in a different portfolio, there's not a lot they can do. So they can speak up about it, but they immediately get targeted by a group of people. One of the big problems that politician faces is that the medical authorities have not accepted their responsibility. And it's a very brave politician that will stand up and say, well, I have this strong belief that this is the wrong thing to do, but all of these doctors are saying something different. So I, as a medical professional, as a doctor, I really place most of the blame on the medical profession for having really abandoned their responsibility to prevent this very harmful set of practices going on and harming our kids.
Yeah, and so just for our listeners, Dr. Amos, just remind us all, what is this gender transition all about? What does it look like in Australia? Like, what is happening right now in various states in Australia?
Well, look, I'll basically outline the whole field for you, mate, in the potted version. We're talking about the specialist field of medicine called gender medicine, and that basically covers anyone, kid or adult, that presents with gender confusion or distress associated with gender. The basic definitions here: biological sex, of course, are the physical characteristics that every person is innately born with. They're determined by your genes, and it's absolutely certain that you are either male or female. In a very small, less than 1% of cases, there are a group of people where that's complicated a little bit. They're called intersex people, but that's not what we're talking about in terms of gender medicine. Distinct from biological sex, there's this new category that's effectively been made up by a group of doctors over the last 50 years or so. Gender, then, are the social characteristics that are associated with one or other of the biological sexes of male or female. These are things like tending to have a beard if you're a male, tending not to have a beard if you're female, and then behavioural characteristics. So men tend to be a lot more aggressive than women, for example. It's the example of a biologically determined behavioural pattern. So gender then are the social characteristics that are associated with those biological sex characteristics. Gender identity then is a person's conception of their own gender and their preference for the type of biological sex they would like to be treated as. So if you are born a male, that is an innate characteristic, cannot be changed, but you can prefer to be treated as a female in public, and we would call that an example of a diverse gender identity, and that would be transgender, wanting to be the opposite gender identity to your actual biological sex. So the process of changing from a gender identity that is consistent with sex, that is, you are a male and you want to be treated as a male, changing to being a male but being treated as a female, we call all of the processes associated with that, we call that transition. And then we say that people who've partially or fully gone through this transition process then decide they would prefer that their gender identity was exactly the same as their biological sex. We call that the process of detransition. That's the potted account of the field of gender medicine. Gender affirming care then is a set of practices that we use in Australia to accomplish what is called transition. And that would include, at the beginning, a social transition. And this is where kids might tell their teachers and everybody at school that they're a boy, but they want to be treated as if they're a girl. They might start wearing female clothing and try to adopt a feminine appearance. So that would be social transition. The next step on, which would require medical input, you need to go to a doctor and convince that doctor that you have gender dysphoria, which is distress caused by the conflict between your preferred gender identity and your biological sex. And that doctor might then prescribe you the second phase, which is puberty blockers. And literally, the intent of puberty blockers is to prevent the onset of puberty, and puberty are all of the changes that essentially change you from a prepubescent child into a sexually differentiated adult with secondary sexual characteristics. And that would be things like the development of breasts in a girl and the development of pubic hair and so on in a boy, and then all of the sexual urges that go along with that. So puberty blockers prevent that progression from essentially being a child to essentially being an adult. Now, the rationale for that, for providing that treatment, is it gives the child time to make up their mind about what they want to do as an adult. There is no good evidence that, in fact, it actually has a positive effect. I, as a psychiatrist, would tell you the only impact of having a puberty blocker is it's going to give you an enormous number of physical problems, things like increasing the likelihood of broken bones. It can also cause infertility later in life. You may never be able to, so if you're a young woman and you take puberty blockers to prevent the onset of puberty, you may never be able to have a child as a direct result of that treatment. And certainly not going through the process of puberty in the normal way can have all sorts of implications for things like your sexual function and even your ability to have a satisfying relationship with someone as an adult. So certainly not a benign process. It has been suggested that this is a benign thing to happen, but it's got all sorts of bad consequences later on in life.
Yeah, I mean, that just makes a lot of sense. But I just want to remind our listeners, so in Australia right now, as a person under the age of 18, you can choose to go on this journey that Dr. Amos has just described. And Dr. Amos, the thing that amazes me is that in Australia, when you're under 18, you can't buy alcohol. You can't, legally drive a car until you're 17 in most states. You can't vote in an election. If there was a war and conscription was introduced, you'd have to be 18 to fight for the country. And yet we're allowing minors to make a choice that, like you said, has so many potentially negative consequences. And we're letting kids make this choice in Australia now, aren't we?
Andrew, yeah, and this is one of the main points that Chloe, who is a detransitioner from America, made. It is not possible for a child to understand that the decision that they're making before they hit puberty. It is just intuitively apparent to anybody that knows kids who haven't gone through that process of puberty. Kids don't understand anything about the nature of a sexual relationship. They certainly don't have any concept of what it would be to become pregnant and then go on to have a child. One of the most heartbreaking things about the story that Chloe told is she went through this process of transition, ending with her at the age of 15 having her breasts cut off, what's called a mastectomy, double mastectomy. Shortly after that, she realised, well, I no longer believe that I'm a boy, and I really want to have a family. And she's now in the position, she doesn't know if she'll ever be able to bear children. She doesn't know whether she'll be able to, if she does become pregnant, whether she'll be able to safely deliver that child or whether there'll be problems with the child. And she is absolutely certain that she'll never be able to breastfeed. So a child who's making this decision before the age of 12 or 13, in fact, probably before the age of 15 or 16, really has no concept of what they're giving up. And so as a doctor, medically, it's completely unethical for a doctor to allow this consent process to happen. The other point that Chloe made is parents, who are often put in the position of being the substitute decision makers for these kids, are also being lied to. The worst lie, Andrew, they are told, if you do not allow this child to transition, they're likely to commit suicide. Again, this is absolutely untrue. This is a lie. This is emotional manipulation to force these parents to act against their better judgment about their kids' safety and health. It's just an appalling abuse of the responsibility that a doctor has to protect their patients and give them accurate information.
Absolutely, and I want to remind our listeners again that this is happening right now in Australia. I think it was Wendy Francis that said at the meeting last night in Brisbane that she got a freedom of information request granted, and I think they found there's 17 children in Victoria between the ages, I think it was 4 and 6, who have started this journey down gender transition, if I'm not wrong. And so we have small kids, and parents, like you said, are trusting the medical professionals in Australia that this is actually a good decision for their children. And it is mind-boggling for those of us on the outside, but on that coalface, Dr. Amos, it's happening right now in Australia, isn't it?
It is indeed. Look, a point that I made in the presentation last night, this is something that's exploded over the last 10 years. Before 2010, you could count on the fingers of one hand the number of kids presenting with this in any year. Last year, 2023, there were thousands of kids somewhere on this pathway from gender confusion all the way through to full transition with hormone therapy and surgical removal of the sexual organs. So thousands of kids in Australia at the moment are subject to these harmful practices.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. Now, just to remind our listeners, this is Dr. Andrew Amos. He is a psychiatrist, and he's obviously done years of study in psychiatry, and he's looking at this not only as a concerned Christian man, but also as a psychiatrist, as a medical professional. Dr. Amos, where has the Australian medical system let our kids down in this whole process? What has happened?
Look, it's been an abandonment of the responsibility of the medical profession. As with everything else, Andrew, there is some politics involved with this, internal politics within the medical professional world. Doctors really like to act as autonomous agents and focus on what we are individually doing, and we often don't act as a profession that is monitoring what our colleagues are doing. There's an assumption that if a doctor's doing it, you assume that they have the integrity to do what's right and do what's good. In this case, that assumption is clearly going wrong. It really only takes a few doctors with a passionate intensity to get some sort of policy through, to, for example, get onto a committee that makes decisions about clinical guidelines, which are the blueprints for healthcare in a particular area of medicine. So if you get 4 or 5 doctors on the right committee, you can effectively write the policy. And unfortunately, our medical leaders don't have the courage to stand up and say, this is clearly wrong. This small group of doctors have done the wrong thing. They are acting unethically, and we as a medical profession have to stop that. The best indication of that, there are multiple international reviews now. So England in particular has just done a big one called the CAS review, but also Sweden and Finland and elsewhere in Europe. Multiple international reviews have shown, for example, that puberty blockers do not improve the health or mental health of kids, and they do definite harm. As I said, they cause this infertility and so on. So the fact that our medical authorities in Australia are not willing to put a stop to this harmful practice indicates that they really are not acting with the integrity that we would expect of medical professionals.
Yeah, it's and last night I was at the Brisbane meeting last night, and just talking to members of the audience afterwards, I think the general feeling was everyone was really surprised at just how bad this issue is in Australia. It's almost like it's really gone under the radar a lot, and a lot of people were just really horrified. And then you hear Chloe's story. I'll be honest, I interviewed Chloe on the radio yesterday, Dr. Amos, and then to hear that story again last night, I found it very difficult to listen to it because it's just so dark and it's just so sad. This beautiful young lady that transitioned to a boy, and now she's back to a girl. And like you said, she's lost some of her female functions. She's only 19, and it's horrible. It's horrible. But Dr. Amos, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. You're obviously at an airport about to fly somewhere. You're a busy man.
True.
You've given us your time. But I do want to talk to you moving forward, ongoing about this issue. But I want to just let our listeners know there is something we can all do. We can go to the ACL website. It's acl.org.au. That's acl.org.au. And I believe every Christian person in Australia, we should go through the ACL and find out what we can do to contact our local MPs and just join the pushback against this, because there are children in Australia right now making horrible choices because our governments in our various states have enabled them to do this, and they're making choices which are really detrimental to their mental health, their physical health, and just their general well-being as young men and young women. I want to encourage everyone, go to that website, acl.org.au, and let's all join this fight to push back against this thing. Because, Dr. Amos, this kind of reminds me of something I would have read about in Nazi Germany in World War II, when their doctors and scientists were just given free rein just to mess with people in the name of science. It kind of feels like that. When I heard Chloe's story, I thought, I can't believe that the Californian authorities allowed this to happen to her. And it feels like it's happening here now as well.
It does have a lot of similarities with various eugenics movements. The Nazis were probably the worst of them. Yeah, but it's really interfering with human nature in order to push a political ideology. And look, I do view it as a form of evil.
Yeah. Well, once again, Dr. Amos, thank you so much for your time, and encourage all of our listeners, go to the ACL website. That's acl.org.au. Dr. Amos, safe travels today, and looking forward to speaking with you again about this very important issue.
Many thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.